In an old western, the camera zooms in on a lone cowboy by the campfire. The sky burns in fiery shades, and a worn-out tin of beans rests on his lap. A perfect shot, any fan of the genre would say. But what if I told you that almost none of that matched real life? During the long cattle drives of the 19th century, cowboys ate out of necessity. Brutally monotonous meals, almost rock-hard salted meat, watery coffee, stale bread, and, when they had the guts, organ meat or cow tongue preserved in fat. No poetic pauses under the stars. Eating meant gulping food down fast before the wind covered everything in dust. This forgotten side shows a West built on adaptation and resourcefulness, far from the romantic image in the movies. If uncovering the truth behind the myths gets your heart racing, go ahead and hit like, turn on notifications, and come along with us. Because the stories ahead will change the way you think about survival. Meat, beans, and biscuits, the fuel behind the great cattle drives. On every long journey out west, the first question was never where to sleep, but how to keep a hungry crew fed for weeks, miles away from any kind of store. The answer fit into 3 saddle-ready items: meat, beans, and hard biscuits. This trio wasn't about taste. It was about keeping arms and legs moving. Let's start with the meat. Even though the trail was packed with cattle, a juicy steak was almost a myth. The herd was the boss's entire profit, and wasting a healthy animal was like throwing money away. So only the ones that limped, got sick, or fell behind ended up in the pot. Even then, not much of it made it to the plate tender. The cook would slice the meat, salt it heavily, and let the sun turn it into tough jerky. So salty it made your teeth squeak, but it held up in the desert heat. When luck allowed for a fresh kill, no part went unused. After searing tough steaks in the pan, the leftover fat got a handful of flour. That's how sop was born, nicknamed Texas butter. A thick gravy poured over biscuits that broke up the monotony of pure salt. If meat gave you energy, beans gave you stamina. A humble little grain, it filled cast iron pots and cooked slowly while the stars moved overhead. Every scoop was long-lasting fuel, cheap, easy to carry, and as reliable as a horse. Then came the biscuit, dense and nearly waterless, rounding out the calorie equation. Light in the saddlebag, heavy in the gut, always ready to soak up sop or the dark broth from the beans. This dry routine built a kind of food discipline that kept men and herds pushing forward day after day, through dust and blazing sun. And even if flavor wasn't the priority, the promise of another portion was enough to make sure no one got left behind. Out of everything in the wagon train, pinto beans ran the show. Cheap, filling, and easy to pack between tight crates. Prep started at dawn. The cook would fill a pot with beans and water. The bumps of the trail shook that mix all day, speeding up the soak. As soon as the convoy stopped, usually after dark, the pot went straight to a low fire where it bubbled for hours, turning into the main dish for breakfast. It earned some funny nicknames like Prairie Fuel and Whistlin' Pulp, proof of its noisy reputation. Another staple of the roaming diet was sourdough biscuit. The cook guarded his starter like a lucky charm, feeding it daily with flour and water, keeping it alive even on freezing nights by sleeping with the jar tucked against his chest for warmth. Before the sun came up, he'd pull off a chunk of dough, shape it into thick rounds, and bake them on a hot griddle. That first whiff cut through the tents, woke the men, and broke the monotony of the harsh land. At the other end of the scale was hardtack, no-nonsense backup rations. Just flour, water, salt, and an oven, baked until it turned into an almost indestructible brick. Cowboys called it musket flannel. If you dropped it, it would bounce before it cracked. You couldn't eat it dry. It only gave in after a good soak in boiling coffee, when it finally softened and reminded everyone that sometimes toughness beats taste. Cookie, the king of the campfire on the cattle trails. Forget the image of the lone cowboy cutting through the desert all by himself. A cattle drive worked more like a village on wheels, with a strict chain of command and clearly defined roles. At the heart of that machine was the chuck wagon, an invention by Charles Goodnight in 1866. An old military wagon turned into a mobile pantry and kitchen. Inside it traveled spices, cast iron pots, blacksmith tools, blankets, and everything else that kept the crew moving. Running that little empire was a man known simply as Cookie. Second in command, he made more than even the most skilled cowboy, and his reputation mattered so much that many hands wouldn't sign on until they knew who'd be working the fire. A good meal kept the body going, and on a journey that lasted weeks, it kept morale up too. Cookie's day started before dawn. By around 3 in the morning, he was already grinding coffee and stacking up dry cow chips to light the fire. While the sky still held stars, the smell of skillet bread and salted meat drifted through the air. As soon as the crew finished breakfast, he'd wash up, tie everything down, and drive his mule team ahead to set up the next camp. Once there, he'd rebuild the kitchen, dig a fresh fire pit, and start the whole ritual over again. A rhythm that set the tone for the evening. Between the creaking wagon wheels and the crackling firewood, his beans would bubble like a promise of comfort. Hungry cowboys knew that as long as the smoke rose straight into the sky, the journey was still on track. And when the sun dipped low, the glow from Cookie's fire became a beacon, guiding men and cattle through the dark plains. Out on the open trail, Cookie wore a lot of hats. Makeshift doctor, emergency dentist, on-the-spot barber, and even the trusted keeper of the cowboys' hard-earned cash. At nightfall, he had one more job. He'd turn the chuck wagon's wheel until the bumper lined up with the North Star. That quiet move set the direction for the whole outfit at sunrise. The area around the wagon was considered sacred ground. An unspoken code protected the pots, the supplies, and Cookie's patience. The first rule was non-negotiable. Never ride your horse close enough to kick dust onto the food. When the meal was ready, Cookie would let out one loud call, "Come and get it!" And only then would the line form. Eating was a serious thing. Everyone stepped away from the fire, cleaned their plate down to the last bean, and kept the small talk to a minimum. Leaving food behind was seen as straight-up disrespect. Even coffee had its own system. Whoever was pouring and heard the call "Coffee Man" was on duty to fill any empty cup nearby. Break the rules, and you'd find out real fast that Cookie's strongest seasoning was his authority. Raw trail flavors, the cowboy art of no-waste cooking. Among makeshift stoves under the endless sky, the true essence of cowboy cooking showed up in the extreme ways they found to fill the pot. One simple rule applied: nothing goes to waste. That mindset pushed the cook to use every last inch of the herd. And the high point of that practice came with a name as gritty as life on the trail: Son of a Gun Stew. When a just-weaned calf didn't have the strength to keep up with the herd, it became dinner. Everything went into the pot: tender muscle, heart, liver, tongue, kidneys, and to thicken it up, the brain. They'd even toss in the marrow gut, a milky white tube found between the stomachs, only present while the calf is still nursing, known for its rich flavor that had plenty of cowboys coming back for seconds. This use-it-all mindset continued during cattle branding. The results of castration weren't thrown out. They became calf fries, also known as Rocky Mountain oysters. Seasoned with coarse salt, dusted in cornmeal, and deep-fried in hot fat, they came out golden, crispy, and with a light almond flavor that surprised first-timers. When supplies from the ranch ran out, the crew turned to whatever the land had to offer. Deer, turkey, and rabbit usually made it to the table. But the definition of game could stretch to include snakes, even possums. Old pioneer guides taught how to pull them from traps and, more importantly, how to carefully remove the possum's scent glands, a key step in making sure the meat didn't stink up the pan. Wild plants were part of the mix too. Field sorrel, for example, stood in for lemon in pies that balanced tart and sweet in a simple crust cooked in cast iron. Every spoonful told a story. A menu shaped by the urgency to use every scrap ended up feeding more than just the body. It built the very identity of the cattle-driving crew, always reminding them that grit and creativity could fit in a single steaming stew. Six-shooter coffee, cowboy fuel, and its silent risks. Right after the fire started to crackle, the smell of coffee let everyone know the day was about to begin out on the plains. For those who'd spent the night wide awake watching over the herd, that first sip wasn't a luxury. It was fuel. The cook would fill the kettle, let the water boil, and toss in a handful of grounds for every mug. A few minutes later, you'd have a brew so thick and dark it earned the nickname six-shooter coffee. Folks said it was strong enough to float a revolver on top. That routine changed when Arbuckle's Ariosa came on the scene. Up until then, the cook had to roast green coffee beans over coals, a slow job with plenty of room for mistakes. The Arbuckle brothers fixed that by coating roasted beans in a thin layer of caramelized sugar. That seal locked in the aroma and kept the coffee from going rancid, delivering the same flavor in every sack sent out to the trail. And just like that, the era of unpredictable coffee came to an end. But cowboys didn't run on caffeine alone. There was always room in the saddlebag for a bottle of whiskey, a go-to remedy for toothaches, stubborn coughs, or rattlesnake bites. Food on the long drives was loaded with calories, jerky, beans, lard, but came up real short on vitamins A and C. That gap came with a price. After months without fresh fruits or veggies, a lot of cowboys ended up with scurvy, bleeding gums and all, knocking down even the toughest among them. When that threat showed up, salvation came in the form of canned tomatoes, guarded like gold. Fever, weakness, and open wounds were more constant companions than any stray bullet. Along the cattle drives, muddy water turned into cholera soup, and sleepless nights on hard ground led to sprains and falls. Every sunrise carried the metallic taste of danger. There was no time to rest up, no doctor nearby. Just makeshift herbs and whispered prayers drowned out by the jingle of harnesses. In this rough setting, the legend of the cowboy grilling a juicy steak by the fire is a myth polished by Hollywood. The truth lived at the bottom of a cast iron pot. When a steer went down, nothing went to waste. Tongue, organs, and testicles became the main course, mixed with chili pepper, strong coffee, and a dash of ingenuity. Beans, slow-cooked for hours in the sway of the wagon, were caloric gold. Bread was often no more than hard tack that crunched between your teeth. And if the herd ran thin, all that was left was jerky, rationed lard, and the lingering taste of smoke. This whole micro-world revolved around the cook, a feared and essential figure. He handed out portions, controlled the salt, kept track of anyone late to the line. His wagon worked as a market, an infirmary, and even a rolling confessional. Break the discipline, and the whole journey fell apart. Hunger sparked tension. Tension cracked the human chain that kept the herd together. So eating was as much about group order as it was about staying alive. The more you dig into the menu of the Old West, the further it gets from the myth on the big screen and closer to the sweat that kept those legends alive. Dented pots forged stories that have lasted generations, including the one you're reading now. So, which of these trail delicacies surprised you most? Drop it in the comments and stay in the saddle. We've still got a long ride ahead.